Hi, year 13, it's Mr. Azapadi with a video on Buddhism in the West. This video is all focused on one possible essay topic, and I think that the most difficult essay topic in Buddhism in the West, which is comparing Stephen Batchelor and Paul Nitter, which is on the specification that topic could come up, so that's why we're focusing on it here. Now, yeah, I think it's really tricky, and so I've put together a worksheet to work on, and basically this video is going to talk you through that worksheet. And that worksheet is not quite an essay plan, but it's a kind of a way to understand the arguments that you're going to need in an essay like this. Yeah, and I think it's just really tricky to put all that together yourself. So that's why I'm talking you through it. So you just need to have that worksheet in front of you. You could have it on a electronic copy or print it out if you can. And yeah, I'm just going to talk you through it, and then at the end I want you to write a conclusion for this essay based on what we've talked about. So here's the title. It's Stephen Batchelor's Secular Buddhism is a more successful attempt to make Buddhist teachings relevant to Westerners than Paul Nitter's concept of dual belonging. So what's it really asking you? So these two people, Stephen Batchelor and Paul Nitter, both are people who try to adapt Buddhism, change it in some way to make it relevant to the Western world, but they do it in a very different way, and that is really based on a kind of understanding of what does it mean to adapt something for the Western world, to adapt a religion for the Western world. Stephen Batchelor adapts Buddhism to the what we call kind of atheist, materialist, empiricist strand in Western thought. So, since the Enlightenment, by which I mean the European Enlightenment, not the Buddha's Enlightenment, but since the Enlightenment, there's been increasing tendency in the Western world towards belief in science, empiricism, rationalism, and therefore a move away from supernatural belief. And Stephen Batchelor is trying to kind of reconcile. I mean, reconcile means kind of make the two compatible. Reconcile Buddhism with that belief, and that's how he comes up with secular Buddhism, which doesn't believe in karma and rebirth. Paul Nitter, on the other hand, kind of tries to reconcile Buddhism with what has been the dominant religion in the West, which is Christianity. So he tries to have his concept of dual belonging is the idea that you can be Buddhism and Christian, and particularly that Buddhism can help Christians to form a better understanding of some of the key ideas in Christianity. So let's look at the stuff that you'd need to say in your introduction. The reason I say this isn't quite an essay plan is because I haven't put this in the kind of traditional structure of an essay, like the disc structure and stuff like that. But I think these are the stuff you need to know if you're going to write an essay. So first of all, what is secular Buddhism? Well, secular Buddhism is, of course, a form of Buddhism that has been popular in the West among people like Stephen Batchelor, which basically argues that you can be a Buddhist yet not believe in key Buddhist teachings. What have been key Buddhist teachings about samsara, particularly the teachings of karma and rebirth, and all the supernatural aspects. What are the key books? Well, Stephen Batchelor's key book is probably Buddhism Without Belief, so I would say that's his most famous book, but he's also got a book called Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist. Both are important. But yeah, Buddhism Without Beliefs is the key one. Okay, what about dual belonging? Dual belonging is the idea that someone can be both Buddhist and Christian at the same time, and in particular the idea that the ideas of Buddhism can help Christians to form a better way of thinking about, or better language to talk about, some key ideas in the religion, particularly ideas about God and life after death. Now, the third question there is, how can we decide which is most successful? And this is a key issue, because if you're going to decide who's more successful at making Buddhist teachings relevant to the West, I think there's some different ways in which you can decide who is the most successful. So I'm going to look at these now. So how can we decide which is most successful? The first way you might say is, are they faithful to the teachings of Buddhism? In other words, are these people actually teaching Buddhist teachings? Because you could say, well, if they're not if what they're teaching is not real Buddhism, then they've not been successful in adapting it to the West because they've just basically got rid of the real teachings of Buddhism. Next one: if they are not completely faithful, do they give strong reasons for the changes they've made? So if there's times when they've gone away from the teachings of Buddhism, and of course if they're adapting Buddhism, it's going to change it in some way, but do they give good reasons? Have they got a good justification for why they're adapting it in a certain way? So that's another way you could look at it. Lastly, is this one: do they adapt Buddhism in ways which correspond to the dominant ideas and interests found among people in the West? So this is from the other point of view. From one point of view, it's is what they're doing actually Buddhism? But the other sense is, well, are the adaptations they're making, do they make it more suitable for the West? And this will come into play in the essay, because I think one of the strongest arguments in favour of Stephen Batchelor is that we live in an increasingly secularized world where people, are more likely to believe in science and evidence rather than in the supernatural. And so from that point of view, you could say Batchelor has got a head start over Nitter, because Nitter might be adapting Buddhism not for the current Western world, but for a Western world of the past where more people were Christian. So you could straight away see a way in which Batchelor's adaptations seem to be more relevant to the Western world that we have now. So that's the first section, our introduction section. On that sheet there, you've got a section for a conclusion on the first sheet there. But I don't want to talk about that until the end. That's just there because of I tried to use the space as sensibly as I can. So we're going to look at a couple of issues. Now, if you're going to write an essay on this is one of those essays where you're only going to write really 2 perils, because there's only really 2 issues, and also because the issues have got a bit of depth to them, so you wouldn't really have time to write 3 perils, I don't think. The reason why they've got so much depth to them is because you're likely looking at two people here. Usually you might put say if you're looking at the ideas of Batchelor, then you might give 3 arguments in favour of Batchelor and then respond to those 3 arguments. But here you have to explain why Batchelor might be more relevant, and then you have to explain why Nitter is more relevant, and that involves, so in each peril you've got to explain the ideas of both people. So it means that you're going to spend longer on each peril basically. So let me take you through the first section. So the first issue is, what do they think about nirvana? So we're basically going to divide it up into 2. What do they think about nirvana, and then what do they think about life after death? And we're going to go through each one at a time. Again, I said that this isn't really an essay plan because I'm not putting in a peril structure. What I'm trying to do is make it nice and clear for each one. What do they for Nitter and Batchelor? What do they think about this issue? Why could you say that they're successful? Why could you say they're unsuccessful? So let's start with Batchelor's ideas about nirvana. What does he think? Well, Batchelor's very keen on the idea that nirvana is not a thing. It's not some kind of absolute reality that exists outside of samsara. What it is, he says, is a way of living in the world without greed, hatred, and delusion. So that's what he thinks. That's how he thinks you should understand what nirvana is. Okay, so why could we say that they're successful? Well, first, why could we argue that view is truly Buddhist? Well, as David R. Loy points out, there are parts of the Pali Canon that do speak of nirvana in this way. Basically just talk about nirvana as a kind of state of mind, free from greed, hatred, and ignorance, and not as some kind of transcendent, transcendent here meaning beyond, transcendent reality, something that's beyond samsara. So that kind of idea is in the Pali Canon, at least according to David R. Loy. It also, that idea of nirvana just being a kind of state of mind, a way of living in the world, matches with Nagarjuna's idea that samsara and nirvana are not different. In other words, from that point of view, reaching nirvana is simply not getting in contact with some kind of different reality. It is simply living in samsara, but understanding the truths of Buddhism and freeing your mind from greed, hatred, and delusion. So in that way, it could be successful because you could say, actually, this corresponds with what Buddhism believes. Another reason for arguing that it could be successful could be because this view of nirvana matches up nicely to the beliefs of people in the West who have a kind of materialist or empiricist view of the world. And for those people, the idea that nirvana is some kind of reality outside of samsara is hard to believe in, because there's very little proof that this reality exists, that there is a thing called nirvana or some kind of absolute reality that you can come into contact with. So those are the reasons why I think you could say successful. One, yes, his idea of nirvana matches with some understandings in the Buddhist world, and also because this understanding of nirvana seems to match up with an empiricist and materialist view of the world, which would say, well, we can't believe in some kind of absolute reality outside of our world. How can it be criticised? Well, it can basically be criticised by those people in Buddhism who say that no, nirvana is more than a state of mind. It's something. It's a thing. So there are parts of the Pali Canon which suggest that nirvana is some kind of ultimate reality. And we looked at this when we looked at Punyadharmo, the monk who criticised Stephen Batchelor when we did our planning an essay on Batchelor. There's parts in the Pali Canon where the Buddha says, "There is, O monks, an unborn, unoriginated, uncreated, unformed." Punyadharma, if you look back in your notes, has an even longer quote about that kind of thing. And from that point of view, it could be argued that Batchelor is wrong, that actually nirvana is a thing, some kind of reality that exists outside samsara, some kind of permanent reality, unchanging, a bit, something similar to the world of forms in that way, Plato's world of forms, unchanging reality that exists outside samsara or beyond samsara. It might be a better way to say it. So from that point of view, you could say, no, that's what Batchelor has done, has created something that doesn't match up with Buddhism. Overall, what do I think of Batchelor here? I think that in many ways Batchelor has good points here, because you can, even though there are parts of Buddhism which suggest that his view of nirvana is wrong, there are also parts that suggest that it's right. So his ideas about nirvana match up at least with some of the understandings of nirvana you find in the Buddhist tradition. And also, it's clear that his understanding of nirvana, it does seem to me, more in line with the views most people have in the West, the more materialist, empiricist way of looking at the world. Okay, let's look at Paul Nitter. Now, what does Nitter say about nirvana? Now, as with all things about Paul Nitter, it's kind of complicated, right? So what does Nitter say? Well, Nitter thinks that Buddhist ideas about nirvana can help Christians to rethink the way they think about God. He thinks of nirvana as an ultimate reality, so he does think it's an ultimate reality, which is not personal, but which has some personal qualities, such as compassion. Remember we talked about this? He said it helps Christians get away from the view that God is a person. But so you move towards this idea of an absolute reality, which is not a person, but has personal qualities like compassion. He sees it as something which exists in the interrelatedness of all beings. So he sees nirvana as this kind of spirit which exists in the interrelatedness of all things, in the way that all things are linked together. Now, why could you argue that it's successful? Well, so his idea of nirvana is quite different to Nitter's, because basically he's trying to link it to the Christian idea of God, and in doing so he is emphasizing the idea that he's pushing the idea that nirvana is some kind of transcendent reality. I should say, when I say transcendent reality, what I mean here by transcendent, it means beyond understanding, but it also means kind of beyond the world as we know it. So in here we mean nirvana is some kind of reality that is beyond or outside or of samsara. So why could it be argued that he's successful? Well, because there are, as we've seen already, there are Buddhist scriptures that do say that nirvana is some kind of reality, some kind of unchanging reality. And in that way, the idea of nirvana as some unchanging reality that's beyond the world, that is, you can link that with the idea of a Christian God. So that makes some kind of sense. It is also true when he says that nirvana has compassion. Well, he says that nirvana has some, is an absolute reality that has some kind of personal qualities like compassion. It's definitely true that the achieving nirvana is supposed to be linked with compassion. In other words, if someone achieves nirvana, they reach a state where they have great compassion. That's the idea. How could his ideas be criticized? Well, it's quite easy to criticize them. Firstly, we could say, well, so they're like the opposite criticism of Batchelor, which is, although there are some parts of the Pali Canon or the Buddhist tradition which say that nirvana is some kind of absolute reality, a transcendent reality, there are equally many parts of the Buddhist tradition which do not speak of nirvana in that way. If you look particularly at what Nagarjuna says, if samsara and nirvana are identical, then there's no way you could talk about nirvana as an absolute ultimate reality, unchanging, that is beyond samsara. So if that's the truth, then it's really difficult to make a case that nirvana is anything like God. Also, even when people talk about nirvana as some kind of ultimate reality, it's not supposed to have any personal qualities. Yes, if you reach nirvana, then you are supposed to have great compassion. But no one ever speaks of nirvana itself as having compassion. So it seems like there's a bit of a misstep here, and Nitta's understanding of nirvana isn't really similar to the Buddhist understanding of nirvana. On top of that, you could say, by adapting Buddhism to the West, by linking nirvana with God, isn't that strange in the fact that belief in God seems to be on decline in the Western world? That it seems that he's adapting Buddhism to the West by linking it to a belief that seems to be on going down in the West, that people are less likely to believe in God. So he seems to be kind of adapting Buddhism in a way that's not going to be successful in the West. Whose ideas are more successful and why? Well, here I would say Stephen Batchelor is more successful in two ways. One, his adaptations are more in line with beliefs of people in the West, because it's in line with a materialist. That means just believe in this material physical world. Empiricist, that means belief in empirical evidence. Though a materialist and empiricist view of the world, because it doesn't require you to believe in some kind of transcendent reality beyond the world that we can see. Secondly, I'd say that Batchelor is more successful because his ideas are more rooted in Buddhist tradition or Buddhist teachings, because at least one of the understandings of nirvana that you find in the Buddhist tradition is that it is a state of mind, a way of living in the world without greed, hatred, and delusion. Although there are other understandings of nirvana, that is at least one of the ones you find. Whereas for Paul Nitta, there are no understandings of nirvana which make it seem like a god that with some personal qualities like compassion. That doesn't seem to be part of the Buddhist tradition at all. Okay, we're going to move on to the next issue, and that is what they believe about life after death. This is a bit easier, although what I'd say is in both cases, Batchelor is pretty easy to explain. Nitta's ideas are harder to explain in each one. Okay, what does he think about life after death, Stephen Batchelor? Well, he does not accept karma and rebirth. He doesn't think they're true. At some points, he even hints that the Buddha may not have accepted karma and rebirth, or may not have really believed in karma and rebirth in an active way, that he just kind of accepted them but didn't see them as very important. Either way, even if whatever the Buddha thought, he thinks that you do not have to believe in karma and rebirth to practice Buddhism and to get the most out of Buddhism. Now, why could it be argued that he's successful? Well, he could argue, well, possibly the Buddha just inherited these ideas. So we're going to start with saying why could we say that he's authentically Buddhist? Well, you could say that his argument is the Buddha didn't have an active interest in karma and rebirth or actively believe in them. He just inherited the ideas from other religions of the time, like Brahmanism and Jainism and so on. So that's one reason to say, well, belief in karma and rebirth wasn't really important in Buddhism. The Kalama Sutta you could use, where the Buddha says that following his teachings is beneficial even if there's no afterlife. That's a really key part of that sutta. The Buddha says, these are the benefits of my teachings, and if there is an afterlife and there is karma, then you'll be reborn in a good place. If there's no afterlife and there's no karma, then you will be then even if there's not an afterlife or karma, then you'll be happy in this life. So again, though that again means that you could argue that Batchelor is successful. Even though the Buddha taught karma and rebirth, his adaptation still stays fairly true to Buddhism, because the Buddha never said that it's important that you believe in karma and rebirth. What about you could also say that he's successful because the rise in atheism and the decline in religion suggests that Batchelor's interpretations of ideas about life and death are in line with Western thinking. More people are atheist in this country, more people are empiricist, more people are materialist, and if you are all those three things, you are very unlikely to believe that there's any life after death. So his view that there is no karma and rebirth is in line with Western thought. Okay, how could you criticize these points of view? From a Buddhist point of view, I think is the most important place to go here is to say, why would Buddhists think that he's wrong? Well, right view is part of the Eightfold Path, and right view traditionally involves the belief that there is that karma and rebirth are real. Also, you could easily attack that idea that the Buddha that the Buddha just inherited the ideas of his time, and the Buddha wasn't very interested in karma and rebirth, because that seems unlikely from when you look at the Buddhist teachings, because the Buddha went against many of the teachings of Brahmanism, like Atman, the belief in a permanent soul. So if he was going to reject some of their teachings about rebirth, surely if he didn't believe in them, he would have rejected the whole thing. He was willing to change the teachings of Brahmanism, so why would he have just accepted the idea of rebirth? It doesn't make any sense. So the Buddha didn't blindly follow the teachings of his time. In fact, the Buddha is said, according to Buddhist tradition, to have not accepted rebirth, but to have seen it directly. When he got enlightened, he's supposed to have seen his own rebirths and seen other people's rebirths as well. So all of those things kind of bring into doubt the view that karma and rebirth wasn't believed in by the Buddha, or it wasn't seen as important. Now, some people have said to me, how can you balance these things? In the Kalama Sutta, the Buddha says that even if there's no rebirth, then you still live a happy life if you follow his teachings. But then right view says that part of the Eightfold Path is getting to nirvana, is believing in karma and rebirth. How can those things both be true? But what the Buddha could be saying is, he could be saying that, okay, even if there's no karma and rebirth, you can live a happy enough life. If you basically follow the teachings that I put out there, you'll be happy enough in this life. But maybe, but he's not talking about the Eightfold Path there and getting to nirvana. So it could be that the Buddha thought that you can be happy enough in your life. You can live a basically happy life if you do things like follow the 5 precepts and make sure you've got a positive state of mind and don't act negatively and stuff like that. That will get you a good life. But to order to get the higher benefits of Buddhism, like nirvana, then maybe you do need to believe in karma and rebirth because it's part of right view. That's one way of balancing those two ideas. Okay, what about Paul Nitter? Well, what does he say about life after death? Well, again, as with everything he says, it's quite bizarre, but let's go through it. He does not accept that karma and rebirth are realities. What Paul Nitter does is he uses the idea of no self and the idea of karma and the idea of what happens to enlightened people when they die to suggest new ways of looking at life after death for Christians. So he thinks that the idea of life after death in Christianity is selfish and based on a selfish idea of personal survival after death. So he argues that instead of personal survival after death, that there becomes something after death where people no longer exist as an individual but don't disappear altogether. His idea is that they survive, but not in a personal way, by becoming merging to become part of the spirit, that spirit that he is talking about when he talks about God. So that's the idea, is that when people die, they're not reborn, and they don't exist in heaven in a personal way, but they somehow merge and become part of the spirit in a way that doesn't mean that after they die they're not themselves, but they're not completely different from themselves. They're kind of who they are is merged into the spirit and continues to exist in that way. Now, how could you argue that they're successful? Well, there's only really one way to argue that they're successful, and that is that from a Buddhist point of view, you could say, well, it kind of links to the idea of anatta, because the idea of no self seems to suggest that after you die, you don't exist as yourself, because there is no fixed permanent self, but that you don't disappear completely. Anatta is supposed to be the middle way between eternalism, the idea that you eternally exist as the same person, and annihilationism, the idea that you're just destroyed after you die. So you could say it's successful from a Buddhist point of view in the sense that it kind of can be linked to anatta. That's the only way I could say it's successful from a Buddhist point of view. It kind of can be linked to anatta. How could it be criticized? Well, his teachings are not Buddhist. Buddhism does not teach that we merge with an absolute reality after we die. That is really more like Brahmanism, which says that when you get to moksha, or their version of nirvana, then your soul merges into God or Brahman. But Buddhism teaches that after we die, we exist in a personal way through rebirth. Yes, it doesn't believe that we're exactly the same person, but we don't disappear as a person. We get reborn as a different person, and we continue to live in an individual way. Even if we get to nirvana, we don't merge with some kind of spirit. In fact, it just says, Buddhism traditionally, that it's just mysterious what happens when we die. We can't say that we exist or don't exist. So the main criticism would be that this is not a Buddhist teaching. He has basically made up a new teaching that isn't Buddhist or Christian. Another way to criticize it would be that it's not very successful adaptation for the West, because people in the West traditionally have believed in heaven and hell, but the move now has been towards more atheist direction, not believing in an afterlife. So it seems by creating this new bizarre hybrid of Christianity and Buddhism, which ends up looking more like Hinduism, he hasn't created something that's in line with the way Western people think about the world. He's just created this mishmash of things, which is neither Buddhist nor Christian, nor particularly in tune with how Westerners think about religion or think about life after death. So who ideas are more successful and why? So once again, I would go in the direction of Batchelor being more successful. Why is Batchelor more successful? Number one, because he at least has some reasons to believe what he believes. In other words, he has that idea that the Buddha didn't really just accepted rebirth and that wasn't very important. I don't think his reasons for thinking that are strong, but at least he's got a justification for it. The Buddha did indeed say that you can practice religion without believing in karma and rebirth. So even though there are some good criticisms of Batchelor's point of view, he at least has some justification for his beliefs. Also, it's true that by taking karma and rebirth away from Buddhism, it does seem to match Buddhism up more with the dominant ways of thinking about the afterlife or life after death in an increasingly materialist and empiricist and atheistic Western world. Nietzsche, on the other hand, is unsuccessful on almost every count. Like I said, his teachings aren't actually Buddhist at all, nor are they a particularly good match for Christianity. And also, they don't seem like a very good match to the sorts of things that people in the modern Western world are likely to believe in or agree with. So in all accounts, it's unsuccessful. It's not Buddhist, and it's not a very good adaptation. Okay, some deep stuff gone on here, and you need to make sure that you can explain what Nietzsche's saying as simply as possible. It's complicated, but it's complicated because it's more complicated than it seems. It's less complicated than it seems, I suppose what I'm saying, because it seems really complicated because the ideas are so weird. But what you got to realize is the ideas are weird, and that you might just feel a bit kind of like, well, surely there's another level that I'm not understanding here, but it might not be the case. Basically, it just means that Nietzsche has come up with some strange ideas, and I would say he's got quite a low amount of justification for the beliefs he's putting in. So don't worry too much if you think Nietzsche's ideas are odd, because I think they are odd. So how would you write a conclusion to this essay? Well, what you want to do is combine your evaluations. Here's how I'd write a conclusion. I'd say something like, well, overall we can see that the more successful adaptation of Buddhism to the Western world is indeed Stephen Batchelor's idea of secular Buddhism, and then you'd go into why for both reasons. So because when we take his idea of nirvana both has some links to traditional ideas about Buddhism, about traditional Buddhist ideas about nirvana, and also matches well with a Western materialist, empiricist worldview. Whereas Paul Nitter's concept of nirvana in his idea of dual belonging is both an inaccurate interpretation of Buddhist teachings about nirvana, and does not match well with an empiricist Western worldview. When it comes to a life after death, the same is true. Although Batchelor's ideas are not traditional Buddhism, he gives some solid reasons for why a Buddhist can be a practicing Buddhist without believing in karma and rebirth. And his ideas about karma and rebirth, or his rejection of karma and rebirth, is in line with modern Western thought. When it comes to Paul Nitter, on the other hand, his ideas about life after death have no basis in Buddhism at all. In fact, they seem to be more like Brahmanism or Hinduism. Hinduism it came from Brahmanism, if you remember. Hinduism or Brahmanism, then they look like Buddhism. Secondly, they're not a very good adaptation of Buddhism for the Western world, because the Western world is increasingly about empiricism, and so a Westerner is more likely to embrace an interpretation which rejects life after death than this new kind of hybrid idea about life after death which Paul Nitter comes up with. So overall, both in terms of which one is more faithful to Buddhism, and in terms of which one is the better adaptation for the Western world, then Stephen Batchelor's is the best overall. So I want you to try to turn those ideas into a fully argued conclusion. Now, what I would like you to do, if you've got time in the lesson to do it, is to write a peril as well. What I mean by writing a peril is take one of the sections, either Nirvana or Life After Death, and I've stretched the whole thing out, right? I've kind of gone Batchelor, and then arguments for, arguments against, and then Paul Nitter, arguments for, arguments against. You've got to condense it a little bit. You've got to condense it. So you might say, let's go for Life After Death, you might say, okay, it could be argued that Batchelor is more successful in his adaptation of that Life After Death, because Batchelor Batchelor says that there's no karma and rebirth, and that you can practice Buddhism equally. A Buddhist could just reject the beliefs in karma and rebirth, and his reasons for giving you could say it's more successful because he gives some reasons. I would focus on Kalama Sutta here. He says that the Buddha said that you could you can practice Buddhism and get benefits from it without believing in karma and rebirth. It also could be seen as successful because not believing in karma and rebirth, coincides with a Western empiricist materialist point of view. Then you could say, on the other hand, some people would say that Paul Nitter's ideas are more successful, and you explain what Paul Nitter says about life after death, and you could say this could be seen as more successful because you could say, firstly, the Buddha actually did teach the life after death, and so in one way it's more successful because it more straightforwardly Buddhist, because it teaches that there's life after death, and Batchelor says there's not. In another way, you could see it as successful because it links up to the Buddhist teaching of anatta by saying that there's the person who lives after you die is not the same as you, but not completely different. So that seems to be like anatta. And then you'd evaluate, you'd say how overall Batchelor's is more successful, because Batchelor gives reasons why, it gives a strong reason why you can practice Buddhism without believing life after death. In addition, it's true that whereas Nitter's view of life after death doesn't really coincide with a Buddhist view of life after death at all. It's actually a very poor match, because Buddhists believe in rebirth, continuity after death, and also Batchelor is a much better match for Western understandings in terms of being empiricist and being materialist and not believing in the supernatural, whereas Nitter's doesn't seem like to be a match at all for what people in the Western world believe in. So Nitter's not really a good match for Buddhism, not really Buddhist, and it's not really a good adaptation to the West, if that makes sense. So have a go at writing it. This is tricky stuff, guys. It's tricky stuff, and if this essay came up, they would be aware that they were setting you a tough essay, but have a go.